We are so glad that you're back for week 2 of the table. I want to say hello to everyone joining us online as well. Keebler, if you don't care, can you bring up the house lights a little bit more? I want to see these beautiful faces today. Hey, are you well? You doing okay? We're so glad that you are here today. And in case you haven't seen or heard the announcement last week or seen in Depot Family News all week, we will be having our annual business meeting as part of our service in a few minutes. But first, I've got an exciting message for you. You ready for it? You may have seen our 2 girls just slip out that way because we know that they'd be screaming at Daddy if we left them in at this portion. But Sydney is now 2 years old. Ellie is a little over 6 months. And something has changed in their sister dynamic in the last few weeks. Ellie, whether it's developmentally ahead of time or not, I don't know these things. I just react to when they do new things. She's like getting places that we didn't think that she would. She's starting to kind of bear crawl and do all sorts of things that she's a little bit more mobile. I wouldn't say she's like classically crawling, but she gets where she wants. And Sydney, up until this point, has been a fantastic older sister. Nurturing, loving, patting on the back, just excited that she has a sister in her life. She thinks adult-like thoughts. She knows, she gets it. This is a cool kid. She's going to be around. I like her. The jealousy has not really been there when it came for our attention. But here's what we're learning. If Ellie makes her way to one of Sydney's toys, we have a problem. She's not been jealous for mom and dad. She's been jealous for her block, for her baby doll, for whatever else that gets in the way. And so we're learning early on that Sydney's maybe have some trouble with sharing. And we all know that sharing is caring, and we want Sydney to be caring, so she's going to have to learn on her sharing. Did you follow that? The reality is, this is a good picture of the way that many of us, whether purposefully or not, when we experience this table that God invites us to, this place of community and belonging, oftentimes some issues of sharing come up. Ever been there? Ever been to like a family feast or a meal and the mashed potatoes start to run out, but you see that there are 4 people ahead of you and there's only like 2 servings left and you're faced with the dilemma, are you going to be that person that takes a quarter? Are you going to take what's yours, and whoever was last, they were late to the party, and that's how it is. That's okay. I've been there. I was always the guy that took the quarter serving, by the way. Deep character, integrity, honesty. But we live in this place of community that God's calling us to, this place at the table. And some issues can easily pop to the surface. Things like who's invited, who's serving and who's eating, right? Who's at the table anyways. And as with anything of these practices, this way of Jesus that he invites us into, this place of the table can be a tool for justice and for hope and peace and inclusion and all the things that God gives us the way of Jesus. But it can also be a tool that's used for injustice. A way of life at this table that can be used at the expense of others. It can be a thing of where Sydney, when her sister starts to take her toys, she feels deeply, deeply upset. It's not right, she thinks, she says. But we can have a similar reaction. And I want to make a statement at the start today and take us through a little bit of scripture. And today's going to be a little bit shorter, but with a really fine-tuned focus for us, okay? It's going to have to do with this theme of injustice at the table that many of us live into, maybe we see, we experience. But there's some truth that we have to recognize from the beginning, and it's this, that Jesus practices radical love and hospitality by inviting us to the table in the first place. What we looked at last week is a beautiful expression of the love of God and the way of Jesus. That there's this practice, this ancient practice that maybe is not as much part of our cultural norm as it used to be here in our experience of life. And it's this idea of hospitality. And what is wrapped up in hospitality? It's more than a table. It's more than an invitation. But for many of us, when I think of hospitality, I immediately think of a meal. I think of food. I think of if someone is being hospitable to me, they're inviting me into their home to experience community around the table, enjoying food together. the table is where hospitality takes place, and it's often expressed through food. And Scripture actually has a whole lot to say about food. Did you know that? It's kind of an interesting dynamic. There's this theme all the way throughout, and here's why. It's because food and justice go hand in hand. The way of Jesus and the way that he expressed and he gathered people around the table and the way that he called people out around the table was because there's something in his heart about the way that we gather and exercise and use and share food that has to do with his heart for justice. I'll say it this way. As much as food can be a tool for hospitality and for blessing, it can itself be representative of deeper injustice in the world. It was that way in the first century, and it is that way now, perhaps even more so. And when Scripture talks about food, there's this theme that emerges. And it comes right from the character, the heart of God the Father towards all of his creation and all of his children and all the people that he's made in his image. And that's this, that God has great concern for the hungry. Not just in spirit, but the hungry, tangible as it is expressed through food. God is concerned for the hungry, for the poor. And here's his design. Here's what he's done. God in his kind of system in the kingdom, this economic system almost that's built in, is that he gives many of us more so that we can make up the gap for those that have less. And it's not just encouraged, it's actually commanded. So let's go all the way back to Leviticus. Here's what it says. It says, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Then we get to this wisdom literature in the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs. It says this, that the generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Isaiah speaks of it this way. In his context, God has become very frustrated with Israel with the way that she has these acts of religion that aren't accompanied with acts of justice. And here's what prophet Isaiah says, is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? That last line can better be translated this. It says, is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When God thinks about this theme of hospitality and food being central to the way that we practice the way of Jesus at the table in community with this, it's kind of like breathing, that we breathe in God's goodness and his invitation, the blessings that come with our sitting and experience life and connection with him at the table, but then that breathes right back out to an invitational, open life where the food is not just consumed and experienced, but it is commanded and encouraged to be shared with a heart for others. It's more than a food pantry. It's more than a community cupboard. It's more than a food drive like what we had a few weeks ago, and those are great, great things, and we will continue to do those things from time to time. But there's something really personal about the table. Something really personal about what God says about food at this place of the table. And I want us to go back to the same text we had last week. And I'm going to read straight through this story, and I want you to read it or listen to it through a different lens. And that lens is God's heart for the poor and the hungry. And there's something deeper that he is saying as he kind of disrupts the status quo, sitting at a table with the very people that he's semi-rebuking. All right, are you with me? Let's read this together. Back to Luke 14. Then Jesus said to his host, and his host again is this Pharisee, this prominent religious person. So imagine a diverse group, not that diverse, but really kind of the religious, the wealthy, the people in the same neighborhood. They're at a dinner party. Jesus is invited, and he says this to the host. When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast, the table, in the kingdom of God," this eternal lens. Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests." So here's where he's flipping the script. He's teaching a parable. Let me one-up you. I heard you. God gave me the brown nose answer. Yes, blessed is the one, but I don't think you're getting it yet. So here's what he says again. A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is now ready." But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, "I have just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me as well." And the other one says, "I just got married, so I can't come." The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, "Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of his town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." "Sir," the servant said, "what you ordered has been done, but there is still room." Then the master told his servant, "Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those who were invited will get a taste of my banquet." So at the heart of Jesus' critique of the dinner party that he is at, and he teaches this parable about a greater dinner party that we are invited to, is a concern for the poor. A recognition that the invitation, the banquet that he's preparing now will be far different and far better than what you guys do here now at your dinner parties. So there's 2 things I want to pull out of this text today. And the first is this. As we think about what it means to practice the way of Jesus at the table, particularly as what it has to do with how we interact with food and invitation and not becoming this kind of exclusionary table that people aren't really part of in our life, it's this, that number 1, doing justice, in this case, feeding the poor, is one dimension of a greater umbrella of hospitality. It's one dimension, and it's a significant dimension. Jesus described his mission, that his mission was to seek and to save the lost. To seek and to save the lost. But when you read about how Jesus did that, when he was here doing ministry on earth with his disciples and he was traveling around, and then you look at how the early Christian movement exploded onto the scene and grew exponentially and lands right now in our laps in this moment, a continent, an ocean divided from the origins of this movement. How did it get here? The prominent means by which he did so was around a table. Because doing justice, seeking and saving that which was lost, was a dimension for him of hospitality. And Jesus is on a mission, right? He's out, he's teaching, he's performing miracles, he's going town to town, he's gathering, and people are beginning to pick up more of his message, and the crowds continue to travel with him a little bit. And he's on this mission inviting people into God's kingdom. And he's armed like the most powerful person ever to walk the planet Earth. Could have exercised power in so many different ways. Yet he was armed with the most unassuming, ordinary, mundane, everyday, yet powerful weapons. And here's what it was. The dinner table. Jesus, full of power, full of the ability to make anything happen, full of the ability to go like superhero on us and just like take away someone's will to make a decision for themselves. He doesn't do any of that. What does he do? He takes something that he knows will be constant for all humanity, for all the time, that you and I, just as the Christians and those that were yet to be Christian in that first century would do every single day, that at some point we would gather with friends, with family, at the powerful and ordinary place of the dinner table. Think about that. Think about the strategy involved in that and what it means for us. But Jesus goes next level, as he often does. And in this story, his concern for the poor exceeds just base nourishment. It exceeds calorie count. And it reaches into the inclusion of the poor at the banquet of the rich. Okay, are you seeing that? He's not just saying, give them food. It's saying, take the people that are the lame, that are the crippled, that are the poor, that are the outcasts, and don't just create a banquet on the side for them, bring them to ours. And this flies in the face of how many of us think about the table. Flies in the face of how many of us think about doing justice and how we organize our lives and do hospitality today. But there's a second twist in this story. And it comes because over and over and over again, the people in Jesus' story decline the invitation. They decline it. And I think this is the reality that was true for them, and it's certainly true for many of us. It's this. The second thing to pull out is that contentment, and it may be better said comfort. I wrestled with that all week, so you can put in there what you want. Contentment breeds complacency, or comfort breeds complacency. And so for these people that are turning down the greatest invitation to the greatest banquet ever understood, they turned it down because of the contentment and the comfort they experienced at a physical, surface sort of level, it created depths of complacency. And when the invitation went out, they were blind to their need. But guess who lived in such a way that maybe they had a different picture of contentment and comfort? The people that Jesus extended that invitation to, that came and filled the table. There's something even deeper here yet. And here's just a nerdy thought for you. At that time in the first century, there were many priests and religious rulers that were actually saying that the poor, the crippled, the lame, the very people that Jesus says, go out and get those people, bring them to my banquet, they were being thought of and taught that they wouldn't be able to participate in this great messianic banquet that was to come. They weren't going to be invited to Jesus' ultimate banquet. And because of that, they actually restricted their access to the synagogue. They weren't allowed to express ritual rites and practices of the early Jewish practices at that time because they had this superiority based on their comfort that led to complacency, and then it brought all kinds of exclusion to people. But in Jesus' parable, he specifically commands that they all be included. And though Jesus' ambition was to use the dinner table as a tool to do justice, he was also well aware it was also being used to do injustice. And this is where, for the sake of time today, I must go really quickly. And if you want to have more of a conversation on some of this stuff, let's do it, okay? But we can break this sort of injustice at the hands of food and hospitality and inclusion into three major categories. And those are excess, oppression, and exclusion. Let's talk excess for 1 second. According to the USDA study last year, more than 130 billion pounds of food with a value of over $160 billion was produced and went straight in the trash can in the United States. That's 30% of the available food supply that went straight from creation, production, trash can. Before you're like, well, I have a garden and I don't do that. I don't do that. You gardeners weren't very good either, because some of you with the green thumbs, you had so much you couldn't even give it away. Ever been in that position, Roger? They won't take all the food that I'm making. And so in our context, we waste so much food. It's like you were sitting at your grandma's dinner table and she's forcing you to finish the oatmeal because they're starving people a world away, and you just rolled your eyes at that point. It's true, though. It's real. It's true. And that's roughly 50%. Roughly 50% of all produce is thrown away each year. There's all kinds of complicated factors for that. We make too much. We expect our food to always be blemish-free and super fresh every time we do it. I'm really guilty of that. I'm working on it. Like a zucchini has one little spot. I'm like, oh, can't eat the other 98%. God's working on me too. But food is cheap here. It's accessible and it's everywhere. And so we don't think about the fact that for some, it's not accessible and it's not cheap. And so one approach that we can have to excess is see food as a gracious gift of a generous God in a world where food is often scarce and many people go without. How can we do justice around the table pertaining to food? We can do that. Here's a second area of this category of injustices. It's oppression. When you look at last year's study by the State Department of the tens of millions of people globally who succumb to human trafficking, men, women, children all over the world, most of those people, and I didn't write down the stat and I've lost it, but I know it's most, it's a majority of people, end up working at some form of agriculture or initial stages of food processing. And so what that means is, sorry to blow this up and we'll talk about what to do with it. For many of us, many of the very things that we eat on a daily basis have their hand, like it's been touched by someone involved in human trafficking. And honestly, at this stage of the game in our world, it's true about most of the clothes we wear. It's true about virtually every Apple product and Samsung product that are in our pockets right now. And there's just something we must acknowledge at least about how the world functions right now. That this way of Jesus and this table that he invites us to, we can easily, because of the way we live our lives here, be just like the people that gave excuses in the story for the invitation, because it's out of sight, out of mind, and it'll breed complacency on this and the way it impacts people all over our world. Child labor is widespread throughout Costa Rica and Brazil in the production of coffee beans. Most of our shrimp comes from Eastern Asia, the coastal areas of those countries. Highly trafficked labor supply there. You love chocolate and Reese's? Chocolate, hugely involved in human trafficking throughout the world. Some of the metals that are involved in creating the batteries in our smartphones, much of that comes from a specific lake in Uganda that is highly toxic and dangerous, in which mostly children do the labor to the demise of their own health. So what do we do with these truths? We'll get there. And here's the third thing, is exclusion. Many of the ways that we talk about who's invited in our lives and at our table, and I'm not saying we all do it on purpose, but it's not just the product of the way the life is. There's a truth that we need to acknowledge again, that many of us live our lives in such a way that we miss the opportunities to invite more people to our table. And food is a powerful, powerful weapon to get people to find hope in Jesus and community and the people that are endeavoring to follow him in conversation that will naturally arise. So what do we do about all this? What do we do about all this? Because that's some heavy stuff. I want to take you to a story. I'm going to invite the band to come back up, and we're going to sing to finish things up today and be a transition to our time together afterwards. But the first semester that I was on campus at Asbury Seminary several years ago, like a fish out of water, right? Coming on, I had my first intensive course for the week. I was staying in the hotel on campus, didn't know anybody. And if you've ever been in those environments, for me, I walk into a place like that and I immediately feel like the dumbest person on campus. I'm like, okay, I don't really know that I belong here. Why am I here? First week, intimidated. That's just my own personal makeup for the first round of those sort of things. And I had a class with some fellow students, many of whom were international. And on day one, our professor kind of aligned us in these prayer partner groups. And part of our class time together was to meet new people and to pray for one another and understand their story, because at Asbury, it was as much about what knowledge you could gain. It's not more so about the forming of who we are as apprentices of Jesus. And so I got paired up with a gentleman from Singapore on day one. And he was in his 40s, wife, kids. They were living on campus. It was his second year at the seminary. And in his culture and his way of life, like hospitality is just front and center. It's surprising almost when you start to kind of meet people from all around the world how distant hospitality is in our way of life compared to some others. And so it would have been strange for him culturally not to take me and say, hey, come over to my house for dinner tonight. And so I took him up on his offer. He said, come over tonight after class. Class was done around 7. And so I'm invited into his home on campus with his wife and his kids, and experiencing in this tiny town of Wilmore, Kentucky, off the beaten path through the horse fields around Lexington, a piece of Singapore. And I sit at his table, and he invites me, he gives me the best seat at the table, and there's no silverware, and we're eating some traditional foods, and just for the next hour, I would take a couple bites, and his wife would come right over my shoulder, put more on my plate. Take a couple bites, put more on the plate. Take a couple bites, more on the plate. And I'm just trying to keep up because half of it's spicy, and I don't do spicy food, but I didn't want to be rude. And so over and over for this hour, conversation, friendship begins to blossom. I learn more about his story, and it's incredible about how he ended up in this spot on earth, and I'm sitting at his table. And I'll never forget that immediately the feeling of belonging that I felt that shaped the next several years of my seminary experience. Because on day 1 of my first on-campus class, someone invited me to his home, sat me at his table, and used food to create belonging. Used food to create community. And for me, that changed the trajectory of that experience. And what that did for me, and I wish I could just take all the feelings and every perspective of that and bottle up and insert it in your soul for a minute. That is what so many that are literally in our cubicles, our office spaces, our neighborhoods, at the ball fields, at the gym, at the golf course, at Zumba. That's what they want. That's what they need. And Jesus invites us to a banquet that lasts forever. Let me tell you this. Use your home to do justice with food. Start there. Use your home to do justice with food. Friends, you and I, you're going to hear me say this more often, and I think you'll get it. We're people of the future. As weird as that sounds, we're people of the future. God invites us to this great banquet, and all the good that comes from that, we get to live here in the present. It's like reaching forward in time and saying all the new creation that God is bringing, all the values of the kingdom that will come and be ultimately undeterred eventually, we can reach out and live that and insert it right here and start at your dinner table. Take the invitation that he's given us and extend it outwardly. This is the good news. That we get to do justice around food in our homes. Would you pray with me and stand as we do so?